Doctors, therapist of Reddit, do you have any "no, that's not normal" stories? If so, what abnormal habit or oddity did the patient have thinking it was normal? Story 1. A 50-ish-year-old man who came in for chronic issue follow-up. He brought his wife with him this time around. At the end of the visit, she says, "Hey, tell the doc about that thing you can do." He turns to me proudly and tells me that he can whistle from his penis. If he really pushed, he could blow gas from it. His wife insisted it wasn't normal, but he was certain most guys could. Turns out he had a connection between his bowel and his bladder. Mom brings her kid in because the babysitter was concerned about these spells the child would have. Apparently the child would have episodes where he would just blankly stare at them and not acknowledge whatever it is they were telling him or whatever he was doing. The parents just thought he was being an asshole and not listening to them, or being absent-minded. Kid turned out to be having absent seizures. A younger gal who had come in for generalized abdominal pain that she experienced on and off for years, but just always wrote off to either menstrual cramps or bad food or life. We had asked her if her bowel movements were regular, and she said yes. At some point, someone was sharp enough to ask her how often she had bowel movements, to which she said about once every 2 to 3 weeks. She had been suffering from pretty severe constipation, but just thought it was normal to have bowel movement once to twice a month. Story 2. Guy in his 20s came in complaining of a belly button problem. I examined him. He had an irritated scab inside the belly button caused by aggressive lint picking, but the dude was sweaty and had a slight tremor. Looked like crap. When I asked how he was feeling overall, he said, "Oh, okay, I guess. Just a little tired. I drank a little more this week than usual. Probably overdid it." I had to pry for details, and it turns out he drank a gallon of gin over the last 3 days and stopped drinking alcohol when he started vomiting large amounts of blood and pooping a mixture of bright red blood and dark sticky stuff, Melena digested blood. He was totally unaware of the fact that he was going through alcohol withdrawal, sweating, shaking, because he hadn't stopped drinking long enough in recent memory to experience symptoms. I sent him straight to the emergency room, where they found a tear in his esophagus that required immediate intervention, and he was admitted for inpatient alcohol detox. I read his hospital note. He still insisted that the ED doc examine his belly button. Story 3. I feel like my story belongs here even though I'm the patient, since the exact scenario happened to me. A few years back, my mental health totally took a skydive. As a result, I dropped out of school and had to start a recovery program. The first thing I had to do was talk to a psychologist. During these conversations with the psychologist, she'd focus on different parts of my life. So one day she'd ask about relationships, and the next, childhood memories, and so on. After a few conversations, she focused on my social life. I then told her that it's pretty much non-existent, and it always has been. She then stated that I must have suffered from loneliness a lot then. I just told her that I've never actually felt lonely at any point in my life. After all, it's pretty hard to feel lonely with the two voices in your head always keeping conversation. But surely she knew that, right? Well, as it turns out, no. Apparently everybody else only has their own voice in their head. My entire life has been a lie. Turns out I'm schizophrenic. Story 4. These are all pretty common, but it's happened to me 3 times. First was when I was in about 10th grade and had been having my period for about 2 years. I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to be completely debilitated for a week each month. Uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, passing out from the pain, not being able to move, etc. The day my mother finally took me to the doctor was after I had missed a few days of school and went back, only to have her pick me up early. I clearly remember walking down the stairwell to the office and having to sit down because I couldn't move. The pain was so bad, and I was afraid of fainting. When I finally got to the car, I was curled up in a fetal position and eventually blacked out. She made me an appointment that day, and since being put on birth control, I've had almost no issues. Next 2 were pretty recent. I'm a psychology major about to graduate, and I still didn't realize I was suffering from depression and severe anxiety. I had been having a hard time coping with a huge amount of stress stemming from a few situations that happened this semester, and decided to see a counselor on campus. She diagnosed me and sent me to a doctor, where I went on antidepressants. About 6 weeks later, and I feel back to normal. Better, actually. Looking back, it's pretty clear I've probably had anxiety since I was a teenager, but just didn't realize. Turns out, you're supposed to want to get out of bed and live your life. Last thing, I always thought I just had bad self-control and no discipline. I thought I was just fat and gross. Nope. Binge eating disorder. Still working on that. I think this stems from a need for control, a bad coping mechanism, and body issues since I was a child brought on from comments from adults. Growing up, you're taught that only really skinny people have eating disorders. Nope. Story 5 Therapist. I was doing an intake at my last job. I'm going over symptoms and such to see what diagnosis the PT may have. She started telling me about hearing things and seeing someone in the room next to me. I explained to her that auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as feeling paranoid, are all symptoms of schizophrenia. She sat there blankly looking at me and asked, "Wait, that woman next to you isn't really there?" Poor lady went 40 years of her life without a single person telling her that she was seeing and hearing things. We wound up referring her to a higher level of care, so she didn't make it past the intake. Story 6. I'm an ER nurse. Had a mid-50s gentleman come in for weakness, tried dizziness. Glucose 450-ish, knows he's diabetic. Recently lost 2 toes and is just baffled that he just seems to be prone to high sugars. When I ask him about his diet and exercise, he seems to know somewhat how to manage a diet. I know I can't eat brownies every meal, but can't exercise because his feet might fall off. Seriously, this was his only takeaway from the talk about diabetic neuropathy that his primary medical doctor had had with him. So we start with the fluids and insulin, and his sister comes in to keep him company in the ER. I walk in to find him half finished with a 3 liter of Mountain Dew mixed with water. His explanation: when your clothes get sticky, you wash the sugar out of them, so I just wash the sugar out of the Mountain Dew. Dude has been drinking 3 to 6 liters of soda each day for almost 2 years, but has been mindful to wash the sugar out. Story 7. I was the patient. When I was growing up, I had constant stomach aches. Every time I ate, I'd get sick. I went to the doctor multiple times for it, but they could never figure out what was wrong. Eventually, I started to think that everyone lives with pain like that, and I was just being a wimp and couldn't deal with it. I barely ate, such that I was super underweight. I was miserable all the time. I was constantly stressed and depressed because of this problem. Fast forward to graduate school. My first year is in China. I'm there for a few months, and then, over time, my symptoms disappear. I don't have stomach aches anymore. I gained about 40 pounds seemingly overnight. Now I'm at a healthy, doctor-approved weight. My depressive symptoms disappear almost entirely. But how could that happen? What could have caused such a change? Turns out, I'm lactose intolerant. I grew up in the Midwest, where pretty much everything has dairy in it, and I'd been eating it constantly for so long. It took months for my system to reset. Being in China, where dairy isn't such a staple, made all the difference. I felt like such an idiot when I realized that was what was making me ill. On the plus side, I feel better, look better, and am a much happier person now. Story 8. I was the patient. My parents rushed me to the emergency room because I'd taken something like 18 paracetamol tablets in less than 24 hours. I'd read stories online about people who'd killed themselves that way, either intentionally or not. I wasn't suicidal or anything, my stomach just hurt really bad that day, and I kept falling asleep, so it was hard to keep track of time. When I say bad, I mean absolute agony. I couldn't move. I was vomiting everything up. Paracetamol barely put a dent in it sort of pain. I figured this was normal pain for getting stomach cramps, i.e. from bad food. I got them a lot, to some extent every day, but the severity varied wildly. I figured I was just a complete wimp about normal levels of pain. I'd gone to doctors previously, but every time I'd been told that this was heartburn. A few times it was apparently because I had a test later in the week. Anyway, they took some blood, and it turns out that I had pancreatitis and have had this same condition pretty much every time the pain got so severe I had trouble staying awake. The doctors just didn't want to take my blood for whatever reason. Story 9. When I was young, I had an overbite that needed to be corrected by my orthodontist. He gave me the option to use headgear at night for a few years, or use what they call a Herbst device. After deliberating with the family, we decided I would go with the Herbst device as it would only take 1 year to correct the overbite. So I lived with this thing in my mouth for 1 year, and it sucked. Every facet of it sucked. My bottom jaw was covered with a plastic plate, and rods pushed my jaw forward. Finally, the day came when they were to remove the device. I think anyone who's had braces can relate to the feeling of impending oral freedom and the excitement therein. They removed the plate and the rods but left the palate expander in because it had not yet reached the development they were looking for. This is a good time to mention that the rods were attached to my palate expander with screws, and the bottom half of the rods were attached with screws to my bottom molars. After a couple of weeks, I started to lose weight and hardly talk. I didn't want to talk because my mouth hurt too badly. I thought it was normal after having a procedure like this. They chiseled cement from my bottom teeth under the plate and nicked up my cheeks and gums as a result. One night at dinner, my mom got frustrated by the fact that I wouldn't speak. I'd only nod or shake my head or barely open my mouth to let an easy word or two slip out. She asked to look into my mouth and found that they never removed the screws that the rods were attached to. The screws had buried themselves into my cheeks, and every time I'd eat or speak, the screws would pull and slip off of my cheeks. The ortho saw me the next day and removed them. I still have 4 scars in my mouth. Ortho told me that they'd almost gotten through my cheeks. Story 10, I guess I'm the patient. I had epilepsy when I was young, and I put on carbamazepine. I was on that for 8 to 9 years at a very high dose. Simply the NHS forgot I was on it and kept prescribing it. A doctor eventually took me off it. I had to wean off it for a fair while. The nub is when I was young I had an excellent memory. I could remember the most minutest detail. My family sometimes told me I was a memory bank. After that point, my memory is shockingly bad, like entire long chunks of time just gone. For example, I did a project at work about a year ago which took a long time. Someone logged a bug on my code. Zero memory of me ever producing it. I thought it was a normal thing, just getting old. I think I asked a question here, but the upshot was go get it checked out. My girl at the time was particularly vocal about it, demanding that my memory problems were not normal. I figured out there were times where I was doing something, but had no idea what was going on, but remained perfectly fine. We would have conversations, and I'd have no idea what we were discussing. I'd remember events totally out of order in terms of sequence or completely wrong, i.e. conversations with multiple people who couldn't possibly have been there, lots of things. I went for EEGs, discussed my absences, how I usually remember things by attributing certain facts to some sort of number trick which I wasn't really conscious of. I just did it, realized that I would do things, i.e. a date, and remember nothing of it. This isn't constant, it's just random. I also get sleep paralysis and the rest of it. While this sounds horrific, it's not too bad. I have transient epileptic amnesia, but I don't view it as life unlivable. Just sometimes I won't remember things, even with heavy prompting. I was offered a control drug, but I declined as I don't think I'm bad enough. It doesn't irritate me enough to do it. I just live by my wall calendar, a couple of notepad.txt files on my computer, and that does me fine.